Okay, this recording is for at least some of the stuff that corresponds with Chapter 7 in the textbook, which is subqueries. And I feel like you've already got a pretty good handle on subqueries from what I was seeing a couple classes ago, but let's go ahead and do a bit of a recording as well. I'm working with this musical instruments database again, and I'm going to be running queries on, again, classical orchestra, but using joins and comparing those to subqueries in order to compare that in various ways with either the Baroque orchestra or the instrument families or what have you. So let's go ahead and I'm going to retrieve instruments and family names from classical orchestra. Now, classical orchestra does not have family names. It only has a family ID, so I have to connect it to instrument families table in some way or another, either with a join or with a subquery. Let's do it with a join first because we already know how to do that. So I'm going to do select from classical orchestra. And let me go ahead and just copy that. I'm going to use that a lot. And let's see, what is it I said I wanted? I want instrument and family. So instrument and family. In this case, I'm not going to have to use the aliases, I don't think, because there's no family column in classical orchestra and there's no instrument column in instrument families. So it's easy as it could be, right? I'll do a join and instrument families and do an on. Oh, actually, I'll use the aliases here, so let's go ahead and do that. So CL and then just F down here. So on CL.family ID equals F.ID, that ought to do it. And there we go. So I got all the instruments of the classical orchestra here, and then the family that they're in. So the first violin through double bass are all in strings, and then there's the woodwinds and the brass, and our lonely timpanist down here as the only one in the percussion family. Okay, so that's doing it with a join. Let's go ahead and do a subquery instead. Now, most subqueries, I think, happen inside the where clause, at the bottom of the query, but it is possible to put them inside the select clause as well. So I'm going to do that for this first one, and then I think the rest of the examples, they'll be down within the where clause. So let's go ahead and do, so this time, I mean, in some ways, I don't know if it's more complex or less complex, it's easier or harder. It's just, a little bit different. So I'm going to select instrument here. And then instead of just saying family, I'm going to have to do a subquery in here in order to pull it from the other table if I'm not doing a join. So here I'll do the select family and then from instrument families. And here's where I have to do that connection, which we did the on up here. We'll do a where clause within the subquery this time. And on ID equals, and we can still use aliases down here. So if I do put an alias to classical orchestra, I can use it up in here, cl.family ID. And the most common error I get with these, and it happens to me constantly, is just forgetting to put the closing parenthesis on this subquery. I don't know what it is. I just forget it all the time. But this should do the same thing. So we got 12 rows last time. We should get another 12 rows this time. And there we go, 12 rows returned. And this is turning into a big mess here, right? So let's do a alias for that as well as, we'll just call it as family. There we go. So now it looks just like the other one, and it's got the same results, the instruments and the family names next to it. Okay, so that's doing the same thing. But, I started understanding subqueries, I think, when I started comparing them to joins and see how they behave the same way. So anyway, as I was saying, the rest of these, I believe, all of the rest of them will be subqueries within the where clause instead of inside of the select clause. So this one is doing like querying directly in order to return a set here, and it's not using any of the operators like equals or exists or in or any of that stuff. But you tend to use those when you use the where clause. So I'm going to do another one here, and what I want to do This one seems a little bit weird, but I just want to find out which instrument in the classical orchestra has the same number of players as the Baroque orchestra that has the least number of players. So what's the minimum number of players in the Baroque, and then match that up with an instrument in the classical. We already know what that's going to be. It's our timpanist, right? There's only one of him or her, and so we know what that's going to be. But let's go ahead and do it anyway, just so we can see how it's built. So here's my select from classical orchestra, and once again I'm selecting instrument. And I'm going to do a where clause at the bottom here. And I want to compare the players. Remember, the players is the column that says the number of people who are playing in each section. So where players, actually, I believe it is. Let's double check that. I wanted to type player, but let's double check and see. Yeah, it's players, plural. Okay, so where players equals, and this is the first of the operators that you tend to use with these subqueries. And so where players equals, and then we'll do our select in here. Select players. But instead of just selecting players, we want to get the smallest number of players, right? So we're going to use this guy right here. And this was, there are a couple examples from the textbook that do this, where min players, and it'll return a single row with just the minimum, right? The smallest number that it gets from that column. And let's go ahead and do from Baroque Orchestra. And again, I almost hit Control Enter. I always forget to do that little. It's one thing, I don't tend to like autocomplete in coding environments, but that is one place where I wouldn't mind if they would go ahead and finish that for me, because I always forget. So maybe it's actually a good thing it doesn't, because that'll force me at some point to train myself to remember. Okay, so there's no surprise. If this works, it's going to return our timpani, right? So it's grabbing the minimum number of players from Baroque orchestra, which is only one player of this guy, and then finding which instrument corresponds with that in our classical orchestra. So it wouldn't always work, right? We might get 0 rows if the smallest number of players in the classical orchestra was on an instrument that didn't exist in the Baroque orchestra. Then we'd get 0 results there. But as it is, it works. So I could also do max, which actually, that might be kind of interesting. So once again, we're doing instrument, and let's see. Classical orchestra, and where players equals, and this time let's do the max. So we'll do select max players from Baroque orchestra. And otherwise it looks the same as the one that we just did, but it should take whatever has the maximum number in that players and return it, and then match it up with the instrument over here. And this is kind of funny. The classical orchestra is a lot bigger than the Baroque orchestra. The Baroque period is when they invented the orchestra, but it was a pretty small thing there. So there are like 3 double basses in the classical orchestra, and that's equal to the largest number in any section in the Baroque orchestra, which is like the first violins, second violins, and like maybe the violas all had 3 players, and that was like the most that you'd have. So anyway, working with this particular database, that's the best example I could think of for using equals with min and max. Yeah, the invoices are a little bit clearer. They've got all kinds of data to work with in there. But anyway, that's how they work. So let's do some other operators here other than equals. That's one of the common ones. Another very common one is in, or not in. So instead of returning one, see, this has to return one entry in order for this to work, right? It has to be able to compare each instrument against a single value here. But if you use the in operator instead, then you can return a set of values here, and then with each instrument that it loops through, it'll check to see if that instrument exists within that set. So it's like checking an item to see if it is in an array instead of seeing if it equals a specific string, or I don't know, something like that. So let's first do another join. And what I want to do with this join, I'm going to join classical orchestra with Baroque orchestra, and I'm going to see which elements they have in common. Okay, cool. So let's do our select from classical orchestra. And once again, we are doing instrument, but I know that I'm going to have to namespace that because we're doing a join here. And we'll do, let's see. So what am I doing? I'm join Baroque orchestra. And then on, and then let's give these guys their aliases. Boy, type. There we go. Okay, so on cl.instrument equals ba.instrument. And let's see, there was so much typing and backspacing, I just want to make sure that I just got this okay. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that should do it. So this should return, let's see, 9 rows. And these are just the instruments that are in common between the two orchestras. So it's missing the harpsichord from the Baroque orchestra, which is the first instrument. And from the classical orchestra, it's missing, let's see, oboes, clarinets, and horns. So these are just the instruments that are in common between the two. So let's go ahead and do the same thing with a subquery using an in operator. Starting out with our select and instrument from classical orchestra. And we'll do another where clause. And this one is going to be instrument is in. So again, this is looking for something in a collection instead of measuring it against a single value. And we'll do our subquery here. So we'll do a select instrument. So it's going to select all instruments from Baroque orchestra. Don't forget the closing parenthesis. So it returns these as a whole set and then sees if each of these instruments is within that set or not. And this should give us the same 9 rows returned. And yes, there are the rows, missing the harpsichord, missing the oboes, and the clarinets and horns. So same result as doing that join there. Now you can do the same thing if you for this one, if you do not in, then we can find out which instruments are new in the classical period in the orchestra. So I just switch this to not in, and then I get those 3 that were left out, the oboe, clarinet, and horn. So those are the instruments that were added in the classical era. Of course, we can switch both of these around to find out which instruments from the Baroque orchestra are not in the classical orchestra, and then we'll wind up with that harpsichord instrument from the Baroque that they kind of dropped. Not quite true. They did use it in the first part of the classical era, but you understand, I'm not going for exact accuracy here. Okay, so that's in and not in. Those are very commonly used. So equals matches a single value. Up here, in this case, the maximum or minimum value, return from an aggregate function. So what am I thinking of? The kind of query, the summary query, which returns a single row here and then matches it against this. And in instead is matching, or not in is matching against a collection. So another way you can do in and not in is with exists and not exists. So those are the last ones I'm going to do here. So I'll start with our selector, and once again we will go ahead and do instrument. I might as well have just put instrument and select on the same line because it wound up being the same thing every time. So select instrument for classical orchestra, where, and then let's do exists first, and then we'll do the not exists. So where exists, and then our subquery here, and we'll do our select all from Baroque orchestra. And then we have to do a where clause on that one. Where Baroque, or no, where, let's see, what am I looking for? I'm matching up instruments. So where instrument equals, and let's give this guy an alias up here, equals cl.instrument. So it's really just kind of shuffling things around here, right? I'm doing the where clause here, but the real action happens on the where clause in here. This is where I match these guys up. So basically what you're doing here in the subquery is you're returning a result table only where instrument equals instrument. So it's an inner join, so it's going to exclude all entries that don't have corresponding matches in the other source table, and then finding out if that exists in there. So let's see. Let me go ahead and refresh here, or enter, and once again we get the 9 rows and giving us those instruments in common. And then where not exists, should do the same thing as the where not in before. And again, it gives us that smaller list of just oboe, clarinet, and horn from classical orchestra because it doesn't exist in the Baroque orchestra. So that's all I'm going to do for this recording. I mean, there's some other stuff in the chapter that's important. There's the other, like the comparison operators, in addition to the ones we just did. We just did the equals and in, not in, exist, not exist, but there's also like some, any, and all, where you can say something like, yeah, where the number of players in the classical orchestra is greater than all of the entries of players from the Baroque orchestra, or whatever, So some and any, as far as I know, pretty much do exactly the same thing. I don't think I've ever seen any difference between those. All measures it against all, so it has to match all of them. And then what else? There's like correlated subquery and so on, but I think this is the important stuff, what we've done here. Those operators, and then in addition to doing, knowing how to do a subquery within the select statement as we did first up here. I think that'll do it.